Well, I first of all would like to thank Boehringer Ingelheim for inviting me to be a part of this session with you today. I'll also disclose, as one of our earlier speakers did, that I do consulting work for Boehringer Ingelheim. So, but I don't sell vaccines, and I don't get any kind of commission if you buy more. So you can reach your own conclusions. I will say that I'm one of the big ones that was spoken of by Yvonne. But you can fat shame me all you want. I learned long ago that the size of the vessel is commensurate with the treasure which it must hold within. So I've had a very non-traditional career, and a very interesting one in that for the last now 30 years, my closest associates have been the veterinarians of the swine industry, rather than necessarily other economists. So I'm a consulting economist. I now work probably with the largest systems and companies that there are, but hasn't always been the case. I have my 3X coveralls, and I've been in hundreds of buildings and tried to model the crazy inner workings of the veterinary mind as they have gone through facilities and so forth. I've had experience with a 4-sow farm all the way up to companies like Smithfield Foods. So that doesn't make me necessarily any smarter, but it does give me a range of experience that created a certain crisis within me, because I knew from my classical training that we were really missing something in the swine industry because of the way we restructured the industry after about the mid-1980s. We brought animals indoors and built vast concrete surfaces and housing for them. And what we did is lower costs dramatically, but we moved from an individual animal understanding to a so-called herd focus. And the herd became the product, and the outliers were culled, for instance, as the solution. So we know, for instance, that there's a tremendous diversity in the pigs that are in the building, even if they're part of the same week of weaning. We know that because when they get to the end of the process, there is usually, at the weights of marketing in the United States, up to 35 kilograms of weight difference between the smallest and the largest ones, even if the group is healthy. So we know that they're undergoing, they're being impacted differently by the average environment that we set for them. So when we set an average an average reception temperature in a barn for the wean pigs to come into, we can pretty well suspect that on average, most of them are relatively comfortable, but you're going to have some that are still very warm and some that are chilled at that temperature. And they sort of individually try to seek out microenvironments to solve that. But we also know that these changes, this variation which occurs in the weights of the animal begins in the womb. And then at farrowing and beyond, it gradually gets larger. Now, it doesn't get larger by the measurement of the coefficient of variation in relative terms, but it gets larger by the measure of the standard deviation. Now, my question for you comes from an understanding or an insight that I developed 15 years ago when I was finally able to convince a packer in the United States to give me the individual animal slaughter data from a large farm that I worked on. Before 15 years ago, it was very difficult to get individual animal data from the slaughterhouse. You would get a receipt which showed the average weight of the animals you sold and so forth. But I was trying to focus on the idea of what is the optimal marketing weight for animals. And the traditional way to do it would be to take a representative single animal and calculate its optimal weight, and then assume that that was the optimal weight then for all of the animals. in the barn. Well, there are many problems with that, not the least of which we don't sell individual animals. We sell truckloads of animals that have a range of weights. So then I began to think, well, what is the profit optimal selling weight for a truckload? What is the average weight that should be on the truck? And then as I got into it, I found out that it changed depending on the standard deviation of the weight ranges on the truck. And the most insightful thing that I discovered, my point of view, is that I found a kind of a rule that it doesn't depend on certain things, and that, certain things being in place, like a high hog price or a low feed cost, changes it, and that sort of thing. But what it is if you decide the profit optimal marketing weight for pigs in your barns by measuring it for one representative pig, and then apply it to groups that you market, you will always overestimate the profit optimal weight under virtually every scenario of prices and costs of feed and hog prices. And the reason for that is that the pricing structure from the packer is sort of has a range in the middle where you get the base price or normal price, and then there's discounts for smaller and larger ones. And if you lay the distribution of weights with the mean across the center part of that, the high weight tail is going to pierce into the discount range pretty heavily. So we found that when you have variation in the marketing group, you had to bring back the truckload average weight and make it lower than the individual animal weight to optimize the truckload. And that difference is what you might consider the opportunity cost of variation. Now, the lower the standard deviation in that, the higher you could take the weight. And if you get the standard deviation to 0, it would be the single pig solution, the same. Now, that's a long way around to tell you that in the opportunity to look at the cost associated with PRRS, I began to realize that we're making the same error in the way we typically evaluate the cost of an outbreak of PRRS in a herd. And I took a long look at the literature, and almost to the person, except for my good friends at Wageningen who love to do the stochastic model, but almost everybody else uses what's called a partial budget. So, and if you look at the typical published literature on the cost of PRRS, how much does it cost, it's often idiosyncratic to a particular farm outbreak or a particular group of farms outbreak where you have a before and after set of data. Where we were clear that the animals did not have PRRS, then there was a break, and they go back retrospectively and collect data before and after. But when you use a partial budget, what is a partial budget? By the way, in the early 1980s, I co-authored a textbook for college farm management classes, and I taught in it the partial budget. I wrote the chapter on the partial budget. It's a very acceptable, wonderful little tool in economics. But if you go to the next chapter in my book, you'll see that I talk about its shortcomings and how to make it better to adjust it for risk and time value of money and so on. So here's the issue. If I were to say, oh, by the way, the partial budget, let's just define that a little bit more. How do you do a partial budget? Well, you say, well, the closeout average daily gain when I was healthy was 800 grams, and after PRRS it dropped to 725. And then what you do is calculate the economic impact of a drop from 800 to 725, and typically done on the single pig, right? And then you multiply it by the number of animals in the building. Well, I began to see this same pattern that systematically overestimated the profit optimal weight when you use the individual pig calculation versus the distributional calculation. So I said, aha, there's something wrong here. The same thing is going on here. And in fact, I'm now just 99% sure that that's correct. But I'm working on a paper that I have to mathematically show that as kind of a rule, which I hope to publish in the next several months. But I want to tantalize your imagination today a little bit with a workup I did on a particular data set that was made available that allowed me to at least explore this concept. And then if you have any takeaway whatsoever from what I present today, it should be doubt. You need to become the cynic. And you need to say, are the ways that we're measuring the cost of PERS in Europe, or the way I've come to understand what its cost really is this really right, or is there something that's smelling in the trash can over there where I'm doing the analysis? Oh, that was a very bad analogy, but then you get the idea. All right, let's catch the slides up to where I'm at. PERS will kick your ass. It is an economically significant disease, and there's nothing more earthy than my friends the vets. No economist would ever say that, so I'm glad to be associated with you, Yvonne, if nothing but just to be in the same meeting. What are some of the impacts? Because when we think about it economically, it affects different parts of the economic picture. Number one, it slows the operation of the farm. And when you slow the operation of the farm in terms of the amount that can be produced, you do not slow the occurrence or accumulation of the fixed cost, right? The fixed costs are already spent. And so when you slow throughput and you reduce the value of throughput, many of the costs associated with running the farm keep going right on. So the cost of production on the fixed cost, the per unit costs rise. What else happens? Well, not only do the per unit costs rise because the fixed costs don't change, but total costs rise. Because typically we have to have an intervention of veterinary expertise, of medicine. There's even a shift that we tried to model in what I'll show you today where that we know happens, but you don't see it done in typical partial budgeting type analysis, where if an animal goes into a period of inappetence, it shifts its consumption from growth to maintenance. And so we're placing more feed into the animal without a productive response except to maintain it. And what happens then, of course, is the feed efficiency deteriorates. And then the severity of the economic impact really varies with seasonal and cyclical prices and cost changes. So whenever you see this is the cost of PERS, keep in mind that it's purely idiosyncratic to the price of feed and the price of hogs that were there at the time the analysis was done. So we need analytical ability in economics, which are modeling, which allows us to look at the range or the diversity of the impact, the kicking of the rear end that happens to you when PERS happens. Because it will be different depending on whether there's profit in the industry or not. So over the past several months, I've been able to look sort of separately at both the breeding herd and grow finish, and I want to present my findings. Well, number one, we have increased reproductive failure. This is stuff you certainly know. Either the inability to conceive, the rise in non-productive days. This is an asset inefficiency issue because, again, you've prepared all of these places for the animals, and you've got a feed system in there, and you've got lots of concrete, and you've got lots of people, and it's only partially employed. And this doesn't seem to bother producers as much as it bothers me, but buildings, I don't know how buildings last too long in the United States too, but they have a certain lifespan. And if you kill 1 or 2 years of the performance of a building, you never really recover then the full valuable use of the building because it's lost, it's gone, it's sunk, and the building has a short, a life, and so you've wasted 2 years of it or 1 year of it, or periodically every 3 years. You've lost its productive capability, and you can never really get it back. So asset inefficiency is a very critical thing. So fewer litters per female, fewer and weaker pigs are born. And then we have decreased wean pig output. And that leads to loss of sales, and that issue is a net profit margin issue. And the issue of net profit margin is an efficiency issue, not so much of the assets, but it's a profit efficiency. So for every euro that I bring into the farm from a sale of a finished pig, how much of it drops into my wallet and how much of it just flies out the other end in a check for expenses. You see, net profit margin is the percent of the euro that I bring in from sale that remains with me as profit for future use, for expansion or for the down payment or for the payment of debt and so on. So when you reduce wean pig output or you cause animals to have to go through the breeding process again after they've been through part of gestation, or you have reduced litter sizes and so on, you're really damaging the long-term profit margin that was possible from that building. What's the economics of the wean to finish phase? Well, slowed growth, first of all. So we know that average daily gain slows. But what I want to show you in kind of a very enlightening picture is that we know that growth doesn't slow the same for every animal. So does it make a difference economically if we have variable slowdowns, if you will, among the animals that are in the herd? That reduces building turnover, the asset efficiency issue, and it tempts the manager often to violate biosecurity in order to keep slow-growing animals on until they reach marketable weights, and then backfill the building with some younger animals, which unfortunately is much more popular here than it is in the United States, or I should say fortunately, because I work in the United States, but not good for you. So you can either leave them in there and celebrate their first birthday party, or you can send them out and get a very much reduced value for them. So that's the temptation that strikes at that point. And then we have increased costs, the increased labor, veterinary assistance, medication, the feed intake shift to maintenance, and then you really have probably the fire came, and so now we're trying to close the barn door. It's too late, and so we begin doing the things we should have done before it happened. Like we institute a better biosecurity program, or we start a vaccination prevention program, or whatever, that sort of thing. So reduced sales then too, as mortality increases, waste feed and reduces sales, and the slow-growing animals produce lights and culls, which in most payment schemes by slaughterhouses will result in a discount. And think about this, if you will. This is different by each major packer, but when you think about the distribution of animals that I'm going to be sending to market and how it's changed by disease, just think that and remember that it's going to be pushed through a payment scheme which is not itself symmetrical. In other words, it's typical probably in Europe for heavier weight animals to be more discounted than lightweight animals to a certain point. In the United States, sometimes it's the opposite up to a certain point. But what I'm trying to allude to is using the average can be a very big, cause a much bigger error than you think. So we're going to try to get at what that might be. So here's our partial budget. We're going to try to move beyond that. We're going to say it's okay as a first starter, but disease in biology is complex. You need to have economic analysis that matches the complexity of the disease organism and the organism's response to the disease. So you don't want to have PhD level disease with kindergarten economic analysis, right? We need to raise the level to match what's going on. So I'm going to show you a particular kind of modeling that I did, a stochastic simulation and optimization, which gives us a much more comprehensive understanding of the impact of the disease, and it becomes more representational of what the disease might be, cost might be, rather than an idiosyncratic one that said, on this day when the prices was this, then that, that's what happened. So stochastic methods correct the underestimation of costs, I think, and the overestimation of sales common in partial budgeting. All right, the breeding herd. Just to show you, in the modeling, I actually modeled a parity distribution rather than a single average sow. And the reason for that is we found literature that lets us understand the impact of PRRS on a parity-specific way. And what you should know, if you haven't figured this out, and I'm sure you know just probably by common sense, is parity 3 and lower are more affected production-wise than the older parity animals. So if in my model I have an average parity represented by one average parity, I've assumed that it's symmetrical, and it really isn't. So we harmonized these with productivity of Europe, especially the better farms in Europe, Northern Europe, 2.35 litters in the model, 14 total born, 12 born alive, 10.89 weaned, and 26 pigs. Now for the model, I needed to detail costs of production, so I did fall back on Kansas State University, who puts out very nice recipes for cost, but we just used that to make sure the costs were fully representative, and then I harmonized those also with European cost structures from this source. We used the distribution of, for the sow herd, weaned pig prices from August 2013 to August 2016. The mean 43.36 euro, standard deviation 5.97. Rather than simply using the mean, we placed the distribution in the model. Parity-specific impacts were obtained from this particular paper, and you can take a look at my abstract to get a little more detail there. And we used the correlated corn and soybean meal prices from an EU source for that same period of the market prices, 2013 to 2016. Okay, so here's a picture of the price of weaned pigs in the world that you need to become more familiar with. Right? All of the world is a distribution, and so you must begin changing your thinking to see it as distributions. So if I ask you, what is the price of piglets in Europe, unless I'm asking for today's price, I would expect you to give them a mean and a standard deviation. Then I would know what you're talking about. And you'll also see that it's not a normal distribution. It does have the longer tail out here, which happens when we have certain shortages and so forth. Now, what happens with a PRRS outbreak, according to our model now, when we ran the model, what happens to the cost of a weaned pig generated by a sow herd which was healthy and now comes down with PRRS? Using the literature that we talked about and other literature sources to determine the kind of the drops in productivity and so on. Well, generally speaking, the costs rise, and notice that the distribution widens. And so you have a much more risky proposition with respect to the actual price you're likely to receive or incur, and it will be larger. Now, the nice part about this analysis is you see the very best farms with PRRS actually have a lower cost per piglet than the worst outcomes in healthy herds. So, there is actually crossover in that when you look over the, say a 3-year period. Farms which know how to work PRRS or which have a light case and happen to hit when profits are high and so on. So we don't have this single number, we have this sort of understanding of how costs change. All right, this kind of strange distribution here is caused by the distribution of market prices for pigs. This is the actual distribution of prices over that 3-year period. The weaned pig, I've translated this into net income, but the price of piglets is what causes this sort of shape. We were looking at the cost before. So you would say we calculate the average price over the last 3 years, or average net income, profit, over the last 3 years has been about $7 per weaned pig for farms in Europe with a standard deviation of 6. So if you looked at the experience in kind of a 90th percentile range, it would range from losing $3 to up to $16 a head if you were selling weaned pigs like a Danish farm into Germany or something like that for finishing. And then the blue mass that you saw develop there and fade down is the result of how that changes when PERS strikes. The net profit for the farm decreases and widens and shifts to the left. So we fall from an expectation of $7 with a wide standard deviation to an expectation of a loss of $4.36 per weaned pig and roughly the same standard deviation. But now you see we have sometimes a profitability, but the potential for much deeper losses, which can affect borrowing capacity and debt level and everything. So if we look at the summary in the breeding herd, in our model run, we fall from 235 to 223. The turns are slowing. We go from 20.5 to 20 weaned pigs per animal, and total output from our 650 sow farm, 16,630 drops to 13,498. The average profit difference, again, if we want to look at a single number, is $7 down to an expected loss for a difference of $11.50. And the average profit per breeding female then, based on their productivity, it goes from a range with a mean around 182 to an expectation of an €88 loss. So the distance between those two numbers is a change of about 271 euros per sow as an impact from PERS. Now keep in mind there is a standard deviation around each one of these, so you might be at the upper end of that or the lower end of that and so on, but it gives you a feel, I think, for the range. Then there's some classic financial efficiency measures that we take, like ROI, ROA, ROE. We won't have time to really dig into those in depth, but here's how they shift when PERS invades the breeding herd. So we wind up with a return on assets of about a minus 4%, return on equity of minus 16, and return on investment drops to 8.19. Now I realize I kind of went quickly through that, but I go too long and I'm the last speaker, and so now we've got to make sure we finish on time. Bottom line for the breeding herd, without PERS, expect a above average break-even net income 84% of the time. That's another result we can get from a stochastic analysis. With active PERS, you can have an expectation of a positive net income only about 18% of the time. So you see, by looking at this analysis, we're able to kind of judge the riskiness of an outbreak, and we can place that against the cost of prevention. And I find producers, especially ones that are a little more analytical, often very much appreciate understanding and being given that kind of a decision, rather than just saying, it'll cost you $5 if you get PERS. They really want to know, well, what kind of ranges are we talking about, and what's the likelihood, and so forth. That's what leads them to always demand kind of a 5-to-1 return on equity or return on investment for pharmaceuticals, because the cost of pharmaceuticals is known, but the outcome of its use is kind of a blurry field. So if you can give them some of those ranges, I think it really helps. All right, let's look at wean to finish very quickly and the issue of subpopulations, because this is the thing that I really want to catch your imagination about and have you ponder here. Because we're moving into an era where batch-type agriculture is shifting, waiting for technology to be born to shift to precision agriculture. And crops, it's already well established, and with hogs, it's coming. And by precision, I mean we understand each individual animal more than just the batch by its average. So we ask ourselves, we know from epidemiological studies of disease and so on that animals are differentially affected by the invasion of an organism which causes disease into the herd. And not only are they differentially affected, but the process spreads through the building, often at a different rate depending on a variety of factors. So we really want to take a look at how that would affect the economics calculation of the economics of a disease process if we understood what was happening in terms of subpopulations of differentially affected animals versus an average representational animal. Okay? So one way you can think about it really quickly is, or easily, is if I have, I think of a particular professor that I worked for when I was a young graduate student. I taught the labs and he taught the course, and most of the students really didn't like him at all. And when it came to doing the evaluations for the class, he asked for mine, and he said, let's just turn in a pooled average of the evaluations. And what happened was, of course, is his rose and mine fell, and we had a nice average in the middle. So the same thing with, as we think about pigs, if we collapse the distribution to a single pig, we're often giving value to ones that don't have it by bringing them up to the average and treating them as a single pig, and potentially doing the same from the high side too, because we may have animals that are too heavy that are being discounted or being enhanced in value as we bring them down. So I have a particular way to sort of show this graphically, and here's how I think in my conversations with production people, how they think about a change in average daily gain. Let's go back one. They think of it as that black line. If the growth rate is 850 grams, they think of it as the black line, but the actuality is it's the red distribution. And we know that, of course, because at the end, we see all the different weights that are in the building. What happens when it changes to 725? Well, we have a shift in that distribution of growth rates. But what if we have not just this shift, but what if we have this one? See, none of this is offered up for our analysis in closeout averages, right? But you all know biology, and you know a lot about how disease affects animals in the herd. So what about playing, at least, with the idea that we can model what we know is happening, even if we can't measure every single animal every day and figure out exactly what's going on? That's why we go to trial data. So I had a particular trial, and I really liked it for this reason. We would love to have more pigs per group, but we have 10 pigs randomly assigned to different groups at weaning. Weights were taken at day 0 at weaning, day 27, and day 70. On day 28, 4 different groups were challenged with increasing amounts of the PRRS virus. So each one of those groups was given, in the different log levels, 10 times more of a load of the virus. So now we have the creation of my subpopulations that I've been sort of, or potentially, of what I've been kind of looking for. And so I was attracted really to this data set just to sort of see what would happen. So interestingly enough too, and wonderfully enough, temperatures were measured on the animals every day, like you've seen the temperature graphs changing here, from day 27 when they were infected up to day 42. And they had somebody observe them from day 27 to day 70, and for every single pig, marked down 3 measurements of sort of behavioral changes too. So we also had then one unchallenged group, but it had been vaccinated. So we used that as sort of the one which was healthy. I created a temperature map for you to gain kind of an idea of the subpopulation concept. This is group 1, and group 2 was given 10 times as much as group 1. This is group 3. This is group 4. The rows are pigs. The columns are days. And then I made the gradient of temperature color-coded so you could see the warmer ones, of course, are red. So you see kind of the infecting date on the same day for each of the groups, and then you see the blooming of the response in the temperature. And if we can say that inappetence is associated with temperature, then we have animals beginning to slow down in terms of growth and so forth. That's sort of these differentially affected ways. Here's our group that was not infected with any of the virus, but it was vaccinated. So now we have to model these animals out. What we did was create a a polynomial growth curve for each of the groups based on the trajectory established from weaning day through day 70. We didn't have a slaughter weight for this particular set or anything like that, but we had to sort of say, we know the shape of a biological growth curve for pigs, and we know the differential start that these got because we have several measures between day 0 and day 70. So if I had to have perfect information to do anything, I would have become an accountant instead of an economist. So I'm comfortable to try to see what happens, at least with this. So now we simulated the subpopulations through harvest. We created the left-skewed kind of Weibull or Weibull-like distributions, which are very typical of the weights in the building during the grow-out period. But we matched the trajectory again of the animals based on the first 70 days of their growth. The feed intake function, the ADFI, was from a growth or an intake function which was based on metabolizable energy of 3,500 kilocalories, and we used the metabolic body weight with an exponent of 0.60, which I think is the NRC's latest one from our area of the world, to sort of disaggregate the maintenance versus the growth. So the ADG for log 1 through 4, the differentially infected animals, on average at the end wound up to be 575 grams. That's weaned to 105, 108 kilograms. Average daily gain for the unchallenged healthy pigs, 718, weaned to 105, 108 kilograms. So that represents an ADG reduction of about 20%, which is a very commonly found number in the literature. It can be less, it can be more, but that was in the range of what you'll see in the literature. FCR, by the way that we sort of disaggregated it and estimated it from the diet in the way that I mentioned before, showed about an 8% improvement for the unchallenged animals. In other words, an 8% decline in feed efficiency for the animals which had been differentially affected. And then to understand their growth rate and its impact on their value at sale time or on the asset efficiency of the turn of the building, we optimized the group, each of the groups, by finding the target date at which it had the maximum return over feed cost. And then that date it was sold out of the building. So the healthy ones got to, all of them, by the way, finished between about 104 and 108 or 9 kilograms at their optimal average weight for the group. The healthy ones finished at day 133, and here's then the continuing growth trajectory of the other groups until they reached their profit optimal day. And that profit optimal day, those days spread out like this. They took a full 30 days additional time to get up to the first group's profit optimal day, and then another 10 to 12 to get to the slowest growing group's day. So we just sort of assumed there was time in the building. And by the way, we did charge the animals left in the building a building cost for staying in longer than the day 133. And it still took them that long to finish. So, again, all groups reached maximum margin optimization around 105 to 108. And we used an EU packing plant matrix to price the pigs, but there was no way for us to estimate their lean percent without just sort of being very ad hoc. So I only sold them on the basis of the discounts applied to them based on their weights. Or their premiums based on their weights. So net income for the pigs which had no challenge in grow finish, based on now the distribution of prices and costs over the last 3 years. So we're saying a producer who finishes hogs in Europe in general can expect this sort of range of profit outcome per head as market prices and costs change over time. And what is that range? Oh, by the way, this is what happens then when PERS sort of invades the finisher. The mean profitability, 22 euros per head for finishing on the no challenge pigs. If you lump them together here just for speed of presentation, we dropped from 22 to $10 a head. So a change in net income of about 12 euros per head from the impact of PERS. And then, of course, we have the financial efficiencies, which all change in these various ways. So in finishing, our ROI drops from about 8 to 1.3. The return on assets drops from the healthy pigs of around 12 to about 3, and from return on equity of 9 to about 2.6. And you can get the paper to see what we assumed about debt levels and that sort of stuff. It's available on the website. But it's a way to try to change our thinking out of understanding the costs associated with PERS just for the mean and by this distribution. So in summary of all the results, we were able to say from this data and kind of the distributions of the last 3 years' costs and prices for pigs in the EU, that we believe that the typical, say, 650 sow farm, which is healthy and has no PERS, would have a mean profitability for the piglets of about 7 euros, but standard deviation almost equal to the mean. So, price fluctuations and so on, even for a healthy farm, are going to cause some losses occasionally and some greater than so-called normal profits. With PERS, we drop from 7 euros per head to a -4 on average, but we have a big standard deviation, which results in some profitability for some farms, even with a PERS outbreak, but the average drops, as does the total production from the farm. And then moving to the finisher, no PERS, a reasonable expectation on average of 22 euros per head, but a very large standard deviation, meaning that even finishers have losses and sort of super profits from time to time. With PERS, we cut that in half, drop it from 22 to 10. So in summary, PERS has a substantial variable impact on both the breeding herd and wean to finish. There are substantial declines in asset efficiency as we slow the operations down. Again, the fixed costs don't slow down, and the variable costs typically rise. So asset efficiency and income efficiency both suffer. Net profit margin impacts tended to exceed asset turnover impacts. So what we mean by that is, if you looked relatively at how does PERS damage both the breeding herd and the the finishing operation economically, the bulk of the damage comes through profit loss rather than just simple asset inefficiency. Okay, now they're correlated and related even mathematically, but the emphasis here is the loss of income and the increased costs turn out to be more important than simply the slowing of the turnover which happens. Again, even though they're not perfectly independent, those concepts. Subpopulations of differentially affected pigs suggest that widely used partial budgeting techniques are underestimating the costs and reduced returns from PERS. Because by representing the diversity of subpopulations in a mean, we're artificially enhancing the value by bringing up the lower performing animals, and because the distributions are not symmetrical, they're not normal distributions, even when we bring the heavier ones back, it doesn't compensate for the kind of error we had by bringing the defective ones up. Okay? Thank you. That was a lot fast. I was going at what I call 78 RPM, the old records, that spin fast. Mm-hmm. So I encourage you to grab the paper. Yes.
Why profit? Profit, by definition, is the difference between the income and the cost that you have to pay to produce something. So why profit? Well, should I think it's obvious that PERS impacts a production system or a single farm in many different ways. But again, why profit? It's should I thank PERS in a situation of bad prices? Should I thank PERS for not having pigs for sale so that I don't lose money? It's about how much PERS impacts my production costs.
That's very interesting. Striking the ears of an economist, because profit is the penultimate metric for an economist, right? Because profit is the payment for taking all the risks, assuming all taking all the risk, building the operation, foregoing other businesses that you could have done. The profit is the reward for doing all this. So when the profit's damaged, that seems to be the thing that would reduce your outcome from making this decision to be in swine production. But the reason I think that what I'm trying to illuminate here with the distribution approach, remember how we showed when they crossed, there were some cases when even the PERS affected ones had a higher profit than not PERS affected ones. This is like the real world. So we can find those situations where that happens. But an increase in the cost of production is irrelevant without then further reference to its impact on profits, right? What difference does a change in the cost of production make if it doesn't create a change in profits? So why not go to the end and say, what is the outcome on profits, which is the final goal? To talk about cost of production without talking about profitability is to have an irrelevant economic discussion, because we've already shown in times of high profit, you pointed it out, in times of high profit, I can raise my cost of production and still make money, so I'm okay, right? Wrong. I could have made more money had I not had PERS, and that's what the distribution shows. And as you know, in the hog industry, in those cases where we can make a lot of money when they come around, we need to get those to fill the holes when the other side comes, right? So it's an interesting question, and one maybe I'll seek you out if you're staying tonight about, because it has a foreign sound to an economist to say, heck with profits, it's my cost of production that matters. But I want to know why you're thinking that.